How does this link to this?
15 miles from Delapré is the site of the turning point of the English Civil War. In 1645, the Battle of Naseby was fought and won by the parliamentarians. They defeated the royalist army of King Charles I of England. It was the beginning of the end for the absolute monarch, and it can all be linked back to Delapré. But how? Zouche Tate became MP for Northampton in 1640. His family seat was Delapré Abbey. He would represent the people of this town through the Civil War right up until 1648. However, at the beginning of the Civil War in 1642, King Charles I had the upper hand, with his professional armies inflicting a series of defeats on the parliamentarians. So, Zouche became the chair of the committee for the reform of the Lord General's army. The parliamentarian forces, they were in dire need of reform. They still had commanders based on birthright, and many of the men were deserting because they hadn't been paid. So, on the 9th of December 1644, Zouche stood up in the Houses of Parliament and moved that no member of either house shall, during the war, enjoy or execute any office or command, military or civil.
In Parliament, there were two. They were split into two, same sort of way they are today, really. You had the Peace Party, who didn't want to persecute the war to the very end, and then you had the War Party, who wanted to finish Charles off, basically. And it shows quite clearly that Zouche was one of the War Party, alongside Oliver Cromwell and the Hazelrigs and all these people who important to Northamptonshire's history, but also the whole of the Civil War process.
It was this self-denying ordnance bill that would lead to the restructuring of Parliament's army, that in turn led to their victory here at Naseby, where infamous commander Oliver Cromwell would make a name for himself in the heart of parliamentarian country.
Zouche actually put it forward, suggested he was very much in the senior decision-making process.
What does it mean to have been a Member of Parliament in 1640? Today, our Parliament is made up of representatives of the people. MPs get voted in, and so they are at the disposition of the people.
But MPs weren't elected in the same way as they are now. They were picked normally by a small group of people. In Northampton, they were picked by what was known as the 48, which was a small group of people who controlled the town. And so through them, they were the ones who picked. So it was all down to a mixture of religious belief, the importance of that person, and the prestige of that person, because they're knights of the Shire, which of course is something completely different to the knight in a medieval context.
Zouche, on the other hand, was descended from a line of MPs. He was selected for his family name and because he was a staunch Puritan. And Northampton was leading the way in the Puritan movement. That's right, Northampton was radical with a capital R. The county was in the process of being depopulated. A large percentage of people had worked on the estates for generations. However, those estates were moving away from labour-intensive farming to sheep farming. With sheep, you only need a shepherd, which is much more cost-effective. So unemployment increased. What does this remind you of? People were being driven into the town. It quickly became overcrowded, and a deep-rooted hatred for the king was bubbling under the surface.
The questions of persecution and diversity would have played a role in the radicalisation of Northampton. Now, persecution would have transpired on a variety of levels. Northampton itself would have been persecuted for being Puritan, and anyone coming into the town would have been treated as foreigners and persecuted for either their Anglican beliefs or for simply being an outsider. There we go. Now, in your own time,
people got very fed up with all of it the whole time, and that's why you see, although we always talk about Parliament and the Royalists, you then on top of that still have this third group of people, the clubmen, who didn't want any fighting at all, and they defended their towns and villages from all comers.
The people were staunchly opposed to the Anglican Church that King Charles I was dragging back towards the lavish ceremony of Catholicism. The Puritans believed in God in the purest of form. They were bitterly opposed to the wealth of the Catholic Church and their golden crosses. The last straw was when Archbishop Laud introduced a new book of prayer. The Puritans and Presbyterians were outraged, so much so that the Scottish rose up and invaded England. In order to raise the money for his army, King Charles called Parliament to ask them for the money for his war. But not having been called for 10 years, Parliament were not really in a very giving mood. According to the Constitution, if Parliament should disagree with the King, Charles should accept it. But he didn't, staunchly believing in his absolute power. Now, I can't blame him. I could get used to this. But England was now in a state of civil war. Back in Northampton and at Delapré, Zouche would have been fuming at the king's contempt for Parliament and his religion. For Zouche and the people of Northampton, this was a religious war. Zouche did not stop with the victory at Naseby. In the aftermath of the battle, 39 letters belonging to the king's person were captured. These letters were presented to Parliament, and almost all of them were individually witnessed as accurate by Zouche. These letters would later form the basis of the trial and execution of the King of England. In one of Charles's most condemning letters from his queen, she writes,
"I received yesterday letters from the Duke of Lorraine, who sends me word if his service be agreeable to you, he will bring you 10,000 men. Above all, have a care not to abandon those who have served you, as well the bishops as the poor Catholics."
At the bottom of this letter, it is signed a true copy, Zouche Tate. Now, in Parliament, words like these would have been read out to the cries of treason. Therefore, 7 years after the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1649, King Charles I was executed. Out of the English Civil War, the foundations of our constitutional monarchy were born.
And this is where we start to see the beginning of democracy that we have and we know today because of this. You would not have had the democracy we've got now if it wasn't for the Civil War, plain and simple. The kings, it was the end of the divine right of kings.